You're listening to Raised by Spirit, Bloodline by Design, written and narrated by ancestral medium Jenn LaFave. Decree 3, Choice is an act of sovereignty. Passage 3, Stepping into Destiny. Jenn had seen what fear could become when it was mistaken for love. She had seen what silence could turn into when it was fed by shame. And now, as she stood at the edge of a new passage, she wasn't just growing up, she was stepping into a destiny written long before she was born. At the time Jenn and Rich met, he was 6 years her senior. With Jenn only 17, Rich saw the age difference not as a number but as a matter of principle. To him, pursuing anything romantic would have been inappropriate and disrespectful. But destiny doesn't create problems. It creates deliberate and precise opportunities, and within its design, it gave them exactly what they needed. Time. Time to exist in each other's orbit. Time to learn each other in ways that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with destiny. Before anything else, they became friends. 6 months slipped by in the blink of an eye, and on her 18th birthday in 2001, Rich arrived at Jenn's house, standing at the door with quiet confidence, ready to formally introduce himself to her parents and take her to dinner. Her mother greeted him with a practiced smile, forced politeness barely concealing her disapproval. He didn't hesitate. He entered with the steady assurance of a man who knew his own worth, a presence that mirrored her father's in ways neither man would ever acknowledge. And her father? He just sat at his desk. He didn't rise to greet Rich, didn't offer to shake his hand, didn't offer small talk. He didn't acknowledge him at all. His silence wasn't passiveness. It was a message. He believed respect wasn't given. It was earned and then defended. His presence alone carried an unspoken authority, the kind that would make most people second-guess their own confidence, but not Rich. She glanced over at her father with a smirk on her face that let him know she heard him. Already prepared, she walked to his desk and slid a pre-written sheet of paper in front of him. Inside it was every name, number, and address he could need. Everything he wanted to know but never had to ask for. "I'll be back in a couple of days. I love you," she said. The words echoed behind her as she stepped out the door. He unfolded the paper, scanning the list she'd left for him, every detail already handled. A slow grin formed as he shook his head, the thought rising quietly, unspoken but always heard. "I love you too, baby. Be good." When her mother crossed this threshold years ago, her choice, though destined, had been shaped by wounds she never tended, shadows that hardened into fear. But Jenn's choice rose from an entirely different place, born from a nameless knowing that lived within her, a truth that proved itself every time without fail. When the cycle resurfaced, her mother moved in the shadow of the past, but she didn't start with threats. She didn't need to. Her mother knew that control worked best when it didn't look like control at all. She went straight for the pressure point that would keep Jenn exactly where she wanted her transportation. Anything that could keep her from Rich. The first strike came disguised as an accident. She flooded the engine with oil, triple what it required, each pour slow and deliberate, a quiet hope that the motor would seize. Luckily, Rich caught it in time and drained it before her mother's goal was achieved. Weeks later, she tried again. This time, she removed the spark plugs entirely and stood there, feigning confusion when Jenn explained why the car wouldn't start. Though her face arranged itself into innocence, her eyes gave everything away. Jenn called her father immediately. "I'll be back at the house to fix it in a few minutes," he said. As she headed inside to call Rich and let him know what was going on, she saw it, really saw it. Her mother snapped the moment she entered the kitchen. "Don't you dare think you can just run off with guys whenever you want. Not under my roof," she hissed, believing if her words were cast like invisible weapons, somehow it would tip the scales of authority. Jenn stopped. Not because the accusation landed, but because it didn't. Her mother's eyes flickered, just once. As Jenn stepped closer, so deliberately close, her mother wouldn't know what to expect. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jenn looked her in the eyes and whispered, "I'll fix that problem for you." Releasing her mother from the space she held, she reached for her bag, walked past her mother, and out the door. Her glare burned into her back as she crossed the driveway, but Jenn didn't turn, not once. As she continued down the road, she reached for her phone to call Rich, while trying to steady her breath after what had just unfolded. He answered after just 2 rings. "Hey, what's up? Can you come pick me up, please?" she asked. "Sure, where at?" Her eyes drifted down the road toward the diner where she worked, her mind settling on the only place that made sense. "The diner," she said finally. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." Just as she ended the call and slid the phone back into her bag, a low vibration rippled through the quiet as tires approached from behind. She glanced over her shoulder. It was her father. "What happened?" he asked. "I've done nothing to deserve the way she thinks she can talk to me or treat me, and I will not tolerate it." She stopped herself before continuing any further, her voice weighted with frustration. Her father shifted in his seat, sighing, his hand dragging through his hair before settling on the wheel. His silence didn't stem from shock. He knew what had occurred in his absence. He knew what had been done and what had been said, and with Jenn being just like him, there was only one thing left to ask. With one last glance, he said, "Where are you going?" She didn't hesitate. "I'm going to meet up with Rich. He's picking me up at the diner," she said. Her father nodded. The diner. It wasn't just where Jenn worked. It was owned by a friend of her father's, a detective with the local police department. If nothing else, he knew she would be safe there until she met up with Rich. He nodded again, and after a beat, he spoke. "Okay, I'll take care of it. I love you. Be good." Jenn smiled. "Thank you. I love you too. I'll call you later." And with quiet acceptance, he turned the car around and headed home. Didn't demand obedience, didn't try to convince her otherwise, because he understood it for what it was. He grew up in a house ruled by his father's iron fist. Everything came with a price. By 8 years old, he already knew nothing he did would ever be enough for his father. Yet within that same house lived his mother, a gentle presence who softened the edges of his world. Her love asked for nothing, required nothing, demanded nothing. It flowed toward him without hesitation, a constant reminder that real love did not wound or weigh. It lived, unbroken, everlasting. So when he became a man, when he built a family of his own, he made a vow shaped by both of them. He would not repeat his father's mistakes. He would carry forward his mother's legacy. He would love without conditions. He would never make his children fight for what should have been theirs from the beginning. He chose to become the father he never had, and the man his mother always knew he would be. As he watched his daughter's defiance rise against her mother, in her refusal to accept anything less than what she deserved, he saw the echo of his own fight. The same fire that he held now lived in her. She continued making her way toward the diner, the glow of streetlights stretching long across the pavement. The night air wrapped around her, each step carrying her farther from the chaos she'd left behind and closer to what mattered most. As she approached the diner, she saw Rich leaning against his car beneath the neon light. His arms crossed, his posture firm, and his eyes locked on her from the moment she turned the corner. She barely had time to breathe out a greeting before he stepped forward, kissed her hello, and reached into his pocket. Without a word, he pulled out his keys and held them out to her. It was as if he already knew what had unfolded over the last hour, or rather as if he had been 5 steps ahead of her mother's plan from the start. Jenn gave him a look, a quiet question in her eyes, but he didn't explain. He didn't need to. Now she had a way to move through her days on her own terms, a way to get to school, to work, a way to live her life without shadowed strings attached to her every step. But while she was stepping into her own destiny, her father had been preparing for it long before she realized she'd need stability. 3 years earlier, in 1998, he knew the shift was coming. His eldest daughter had just married, his first grandson was on the way, and his daughters were beginning to build lives of their own. He started to wonder what would happen if he was no longer here. How could he make sure their futures were not only filled with love, but protected, stable, secure, shielded from the uncertainty they knew too well? The answer was not hope. It was action. He didn't just wish for their security. He forged it himself, investing his entire life savings, his labor, and his vision to build a construction company alongside Jenn's sister's then husband. It was more than a plan. It was a promise shaped through hands weathered by decades of work, turning his labor into legacy. And while that legacy was taking root, Jenn's own life continued unfolding. The months that followed moved quickly, each one drawing her deeper into the life she was building with Rich. Within 6 months of dating, they moved in together, and 3 months after that, she was pregnant, exactly as predicted. The announcement of her pregnancy was not just news to him, it was confirmation, a reinforcement of his choices and his love. Her father welcomed Rich into the family with open arms, not just as a son-in-law, but as a partner in the family business. By 2002, Jenn gave birth to Jeremy. He came into the world screaming, his first breath a defiant declaration, announcing his presence with unshakable certainty. Born 2 weeks past his due date, she was convinced he had fought against entering the world, instinctively aware of the destiny awaiting him, hesitant to face it too soon. The first night they brought him home, exhausted yet exhilarated, they passed by his crib and caught sight of a tiny hand sticking up in the dim light, middle finger raised in perfect defiance. It was as if, even in infancy, he had arrived with a message. But despite his fiery spirit, he came with his own battles. He arrived with a double hernia, asthma, and a birthmark, small marks of struggle already imprinted on him. It wasn't until he was 2 months old that they discovered the hernias, realizing he had not been suffering from colic at all. In truth, their little warrior had endured far more than they knew. Without delay, he underwent surgery for his hernias, a difficult beginning to an already bold arrival. If those early days were any indication, there was never a doubt that Jeremy would rise to every challenge and walk his path with the same fearless defiance that ran deep in his bloodline. Jenn often sat with him cradled in her arms, simply marveling at the miracle she had been given. One afternoon, as her eyes lingered on the small birthmark on his chest, Maggie's voice rose clearly in her mind. This birthmark is the reason he has asthma. It is the imprint of how he died in his most recent past life, an arrow wound to the chest. What does that mean? She asked. With a small nod, Maggie answered, the body remembers, even when the mind forgets. She studied her words, searching for deeper meaning, but Maggie had already said all there was to say. The message settled inside her mind, quietly concealed in the ordinary, waiting to be remembered. Once Jeremy was born, they rented a house just 5 miles from her parents, close enough that visits became part of the daily rhythm. With Rich working beside her father, their mornings unfolded the same way every day, riding together to the job sites, sharing coffee, conversation, and the kind of work that builds a life. One evening after work, her father walked in behind Rich, casually stepping through the door. No grand gestures, no need for an invitation, just a father checking in, the way he always did, finding a way to make sure she was all right without ever needing to say it aloud. She watched as her father cradled Jeremy, his rough hands marked by years of labor now holding something far more delicate. He leaned back in his chair, shifting his weight, a slow grin stretching across his face. You know, he said, his voice carrying its usual warmth, threaded with humor, yet this time threaded with something else. Certainty. I'm proud of you, he said. Jenn smiled, waiting for the follow-up. With him, there was always a follow-up. And sure enough, you know you have to have another baby, right? Jenn nearly choked on her drink. She shot him a sharp, familiar look. The fuck I do? I'm serious, he said, adjusting Jeremy in his arms. He's going to need someone long after you and Rich are gone. He's going to need family, someone to stand beside him, like you and your sister. Jenn exhaled, her eyes falling to her son. She understood. She always understood when it came to him, but Jeremy wasn't even a year old yet. You'll see, he said, grinning as though it already happened. Their conversation drifted to the trouble he planned to get into with his grandsons, always ending with the same statement. And there's nothing you can do about it. Boys will be boys, he said. And I didn't raise boys. His brow lifted, glancing at Jenn, as if it weren't already obvious to her. Her father's life had been shaped by his relentless dedication that carried him from waste management into building his own company. For 5 proud years, that company stood as a testament to his effort and integrity, but while he devoted himself to building a future for his family, her sister's then husband had been quietly dismantling it from within. Over the years, he didn't simply mismanage funds, he manufactured chaos. He'd show up late or not at all, then try to charm his way around the delays he caused, only to demand payment from her father as if his negligence were a service. Any hint of accountability sent him into belligerent rants about everything he claimed to do for the company, conveniently ignoring the fact that her father paid him out of obligation, not merit. A courtesy extended only for his daughter and grandson. He'd offer customers guarantees he could never deliver, using their payments to buy things he had no business owning, draining the company to appease whatever demon demanded attention that week. As the damage accumulated, the business began to buckle. Clients pulled away. The numbers stopped balancing, and as the accounts thinned, he didn't stop. He kept spending while the cupboards at home sat empty and the bills went unpaid, choosing himself over his wife and son with a consistency that never faltered. But by the time anyone understood the full extent of the damage, it was already too late. The foundation her father had spent years building had been hollowed out by the very parasite he welcomed into the family. By the end of 2002, at 52 years old, her father was forced to close the business and return to manual labor as a heavy machine operator. For the first time in her life, Jenn saw something she had never seen in him. Defeat. Not the quiet kind that slips in unnoticed, but the kind that settles into a man's shoulders, heavy and undeserved. To watch the strongest man she ever knew pushed back into the work he started at, and to see her sister and nephew caught in a parallel path that mirrored Maggie and Richard's relationship, it didn't just break her heart. It seared. What rose in her wasn't a flame, it was a summons. A summons that rose like molten truth, lighting a fire inside her that burned with every shadow's name on it. While Rich tried to steady himself in the aftermath, taking whatever work he could find to keep his footing, Destiny was already aligning the right person to arrive. Kevin. Rich and Kevin went back years long before Jenn came along. They took the same risks, walked the same line, and carried the kind of history you don't talk about, and they didn't. They didn't have to. It would have been crystal clear to a blind man. In truth, they had the kind of loyalty people often claim to have, but takes lifetimes to achieve the real deal. But who Kevin was depended entirely on who stood in front of him. With most people, he was blunt, aggressive, and fearless. He could walk into a room and own it without saying a word, and if he needed to shut it down, he could do that too. But with Jenn, he wasn't that man, not fully. With her, he was different. He pushed her buttons on purpose. He'd do just about anything just to see her react. And once he figured out what got to her the most, he kept at it until he hit the line. He'd never cross it, but he'd walk right up to it, every single time, like it was his own personal game. But beneath the teasing, his loyalty to her was as absolute as it was to Rich. He didn't divide that loyalty, he softened it. It wasn't built with the same history, but it stood with the same force. He watched her with the same quiet readiness that said he'd move first and ask questions never. And once Kevin decided Jenn was someone he'd stand behind without question, that was it. The line was drawn. To Jenn, Kevin was never just Rich's best friend. He was family. He stepped into her world with the certainty of someone who didn't need an invitation, a man whose presence settled into place as if it had always belonged there. Though he teased her, pushed her buttons, and got under her skin on purpose, beneath that, she saw its undercurrent. He didn't give that part of himself to many, yet with her it rose up naturally, without question, like he'd carved a special space in his world just for her. She didn't have to earn it, it just was. When Kevin caught word of what happened, he immediately offered Rich a job at his construction company. It wasn't charity, far from it. It was what you did for the man who stood beside you no matter what. Working together again felt familiar, almost too easy. They knew each other's pace, each other's instincts, and they handled the work with the quiet edge of men who'd learned the hard way how to survive. By the spring of 2003, Kevin moved in with them, stepping in to help a situation that was far more brutal than a simple financial strain. It was relentless. With a newborn baby and a family to support, Rich was doing everything he could to keep them afloat, but the jobs just didn't pay enough to make ends meet. So he and Kevin turned back to the only other thing they knew would. Some nights they'd tell Jenn they had to head out, offering nothing more than the promise that they'd be back later. She never asked for details. They wouldn't have told her anyway. But that didn't mean she was ignorant of the kind of business those nights entailed. On one of the last and longest of those nights, the silence prowled the house until dawn scraped across the sky with no word from them. Jen's stomach sank. She called Rich, straight to voicemail. She called Kevin, same thing. She tried again and again. Her thumb kept hitting redial like it was the only lifeline she had left. Every unanswered call opened darker possibilities in her mind. She left message after message, her voice cracking as she begged them to just call her back. Just one call, just one sign they were okay. They never fell silent without reason, and the longer it stretched, the heavier that reason became. Her thoughts spun, sharp and frantic, slipping out of her control. Fear moved faster than reasoning. I'll call the holding center. Maybe they got in some kind of altercation, she thought to herself. But the thought had barely formed, and the phone was already ringing. A clipped voice cut through the line. 911, what's your emergency? Still not aware of what she was doing, she answered. I'm looking for someone, 2 people, actually. A pause. Their names? She hung up. Shit. The reality dawned on her. This wasn't their first rodeo. So she waited. There wasn't anything else left to do. The quiet in the house grew heavier, settling over her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Every minute stretched thin, every sound sharpened. Then, at last, she heard the front door creak open. Rich stepped inside, the weight of the night still clinging to him, with the faint scent of liquor, cigarettes, and whatever else they had gone through that night trailing behind him. She stood there, arms folded, eyes locked on him. What the hell? Rich sighed, dragging a hand down his face. Trust me, you don't want to know, he said. It wasn't dismissive. He was trying to keep that part of life from ever touching his family. Kevin walked in behind him, his steps slower, his presence quieter. Jenn addressed both of them. I called 1,000,000 times, left 1,000,000 voicemails. I called all the bars, the hospitals. I even called the fucking holding center, just trying to find you guys. I didn't know what happened. I didn't know where you were or if you were okay. Rich stepped closer. I know. I'm sorry. We had to ditch our phones, he said. Kevin didn't interrupt. He waited. But as the tension began to ease, he slid a thick envelope across the table, his movement slow and deliberate. Here, nudging the envelope closer. We gotta get to the job. Take this and get some food for the house. Pay all the bills and catch up on the last 2 months of rent. He paused, the kind of pause that carried more truth than explanation. And pay 6 months in advance. He turned to Rich. I'll wait for you in the truck. Before he walked out, he turned back to Jenn with a look that held no excuses and no plea for forgiveness. It was his way of telling her he understood the price of the lifestyle he lived, that what they did wasn't for thrill or glory, it was for family. In the weeks that followed after that night, Kevin was teaching her how to drive his work truck, its floorboards so corroded you could see the pavement beneath their feet. Feel the clutch, he said, voice steady as she fought with the stubborn gears, the truck jerking under her hands. It's all about the finesse, he added, laughing at his own misplaced confidence, as if the truck had any finesse left to give. She rolled her eyes. It's all about the fact that this thing belongs in a junkyard. Kevin kept laughing as the truck kept stalling, until she finally got it moving, dirt kicking up behind them. Then, out of nowhere, he turned to her and said, You know that night we didn't come home, and you left all those voicemails on my cell. He paused. Hearing you cry like that. I've heard a lot of women cry in my day, but those messages, those hit me harder than I expected. You care for him in a way I wish I had with someone. I care about both of you, she interrupted. I know you do, but what you and Rich have, it's rare, he said. It's the kind of love that strengthens a man, gives him purpose, something real to hold on to in a world that tries to keep you down. She glanced at him, feeling the shift in his tone, the honesty threading between his words. She didn't know what to say. The life I live, he said, it's not for you, and it's not for Rich. Believe me when I tell you I would do anything for the 2 of you, your family. But it's time for me to move out, and I wanted to tell you first so you'd know why. She listened, expecting him to continue, but he didn't offer any further explanation. The truck rattled on, the road stretched ahead, and his words settled into the night, waiting for the truth to surface.